as Stuart said, we're on Gadigal land, and I do think it's important that process of acknowledgement. And this is certainly no reflection on what Stuart said, but sometimes I do also cringe a little bit, actually, to be honest, at some of the acknowledgement that goes on. I was at the Sydney Film Festival, saw Warwick Thornton's great new film the other day, and it was introduced by about 6 different speakers. They had, someone from the film festival, someone from the Sydney City Council, someone from the New South Wales government, and every single one of them stood up and said, I'd like to acknowledge there were a Gadigal people, Eora Nation, and their elders past and present and emerging, and these sorts of things. And not one of them acknowledged, actually, that the Gadigal were exterminated. That there was a very brutal genocide which took place in the basin of Sydney, which essentially destroyed the society that was here, eliminated most of the people, took all of the land, and has never given any of it back. So I don't know the extent to which people want to acknowledge traditional owners without acknowledging that the entire edifice of Australia is built on the genocide of Aboriginal people. There's never been justice for that. There's never been any return, of land. And I think we want to acknowledge most of all the resistance that has come from Aboriginal people who have refused to cede, who have at every single step of the process, fought back, tried to hold on to land, have made gains, at times important gains, and I think have made a very profound contribution to the development of the left in Australia and the development of, a vision in Australia of how we might organise our society differently and live differently here on this continent, and hopefully one day in a way that actually does truly acknowledge Aboriginal people and owners and actually put Aboriginal decision-making and management of land at the centre of how we actually discuss and how we organise, our relationship to place and our relationship to country. I think that's what we want to sort of move to. But what's in the way of that? I think, on the one hand, and the 2 sort of processes I wanted to talk about tonight are, on the one hand we have the colonial narratives, the history wars that are waged to try and bury and obfuscate the reality of genocide and what it's meant and what it continues to mean. And that's inextricably linked to the colonial structures of power that exist, that refuse to actually, acknowledge or take account of that Aboriginal ownership. Because the Gadigal were the first and were on the front line of a very long war, a genocidal war, which was waged by British imperialism and then by the development of, an Australian capitalist class which continued to expand, which took every inch of this continent off Aboriginal people to integrate it into a system of commodity production. So country became what it was before, which was something which had an incredible significance to the people that lived in that place. They respected its specificity, its history, tied to it for thousands of years, knowing intimately, the seasons and how it moved and what the capacities of each place were. All of those specific histories and specific, qualities were wiped out, and it became a unit of production, which could be bought and sold and be an input, into the capitalist economy. That's the process that's taken place in Australia. And obviously, the enclosure of common land is something which is common to the development of capitalism everywhere in the world. British peasants were expropriated, commons were established to establish British capitalism. But I think in settler colonial situations, like the situation we've got in Australia, where it's a settler colony, that process of primitive accumulation, as it was called by Marx, or bringing the land base into capitalism, is a racialised process. It's something which requires the denigration of the people who actually hold that land in a very, very, very racially loaded way. So Aboriginal people, had no real economy, had no real society, were backward, were vicious, etc. So we don't have to worry about them, we don't have to respect them. And there's this tension in Australian history where that narrative has to be constructed and maintained time and time and time again to justify really the entire edifice, that we have, which is premised on a lie that there were no Aboriginal people here, terra nullius. I mean, most people think, I'll just stop for a second there because there's been a lot of debate about native title at the moment, but most people think that terra nullius the doctrine of terra nullius ended with Mabo. Right? With Mabo, finally, we overcame terra nullius. What rot, what absolute rot. Mabo said all the land that's been stolen is stolen and tough bickies, right? Too bad, we've taken it, it's gone. So terra nullius, only maybe if you live in marginal areas that aren't particularly important for capitalism, where we haven't exterminated you to such an extent that you can still, by some miracle, prove to a white court that you've maintained this ongoing connection and blah, blah, blah. Okay, we'll recognise your interest in the land. But if we want to build a mine on that land, you can't say no. You can't stop us building a mine on the land. Yes, we have to negotiate an Indigenous land use agreement or whatever, but if you keep saying no and be pesky and say no, 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 we'll go to court, the court will impose a settlement and we'll build our mine. That's what native title is. So the vast majority of the land that was stolen remains. Terra nullius is the operating principle which has justified the theft of that land, and even the land where people have managed to have native title recognised, as I said, it's Mickey Mouse title really. It doesn't give people any real sort of control. So that's that terra nullius is at the foundation still of the entire political and economic system that we live under, and I think that has very profound implications. So I did just want to recognise. I mean, you guys have got next week a session looking at 10 years of the Northern Territory intervention, which I'd highly recommend people come along to hear, because I think in the intervention you can really see that crucible between the colonial narratives and the colonial structures of power very, very, heavily fused together through the whole process of the intervention. What was the intervention about? The intervention was John Howard's final vicious contribution to the history wars, really, that he'd fought, and if people don't know what the history wars are, this is where basically he persecuted teachers and academics and other people that wanted to say there was genocide in Australia, promoted people like Keith Windschuttle, which denied that there were massacres, denied that there was a stolen generation, etc., etc. And that went along with a whole lot of really horrible things being said about Aboriginal people and about Aboriginal culture. The whole idea that there was this, endemic violence against women and children and sexual depravity, and that all of these sorts of things were somehow part of traditional Aboriginal society. With the intervention, what they tried to say was the horrible social conditions which had been created by Australian capitalism, by the process of dispossession, by the brutalisation under the Protection Acts, under the stations that people were forced to slave on, everything like that, the ongoing neglect of basic services that everyone takes for granted, which means people have trachoma, diseases that are only in the so-called third world are right here in Australia. How do you explain that? How do you explain that? How do you justify that to the United Nations? How do you explain that to the world? Howard's explanation was, this is because they can't look after themselves. We gave them a go. We gave them some community councils, with the self-determination process out of Whitlam. We gave them some rights to their land again, and look at what they did. These are the conditions that they're in. He said self-determination has failed. We need paternalism back. We need assimilation back. We need to revere the missionaries who went out to try and help Aboriginal people. We can't continue to demonise them. We need to revere them. And they recreated, with the intervention, the protection system that existed for most of the 20th century. That's what they've done. They've rebuilt the Aborigines Protection Board again in the Northern Territory. People are second-class citizens under the law. Across Australia, Aboriginal people are viciously persecuted and discriminated against, right? World-beating incarceration rates, removal of children at absolutely horrific rates. I could talk about that all night. It's just appalling what is going on, the theft of Aboriginal children by so-called child protection agencies in this country. Any story you've heard about what happened in the stolen generation, with kids being ripped away from their mothers, crying by police, by welfare workers who've made racist judgments, happened last week. I can tell you now, somewhere in Australia it happened last week. That exact scene was played out somewhere in Australia. There's more than 17,000 Aboriginal children in so-called out-of-home care as a result of forced removal from their family. So that's the situation that exists across Australia. In the Northern Territory, it's written into law that there's special child protection teams that only look at black children and only remove black children. It's written into law that police can go into Aboriginal houses without a warrant to search for alcohol or to search for pornography, things that adults can have in Australia, but blacks can't because they're just like children, right? We need to look after them with special laws like we've got in the Northern Territory. People are again subject to rationing, this basics card that they have. They can only buy certain items at government-approved stores, etc. So the whole edifice of the sort of protection system that existed in the 20th century is back with a vengeance. It's there in the Northern Territory. It costs millions and millions of dollars to run, right? It's paying off thousands of white people's mortgages. And yet they say that remote communities are economically unviable. And there's no market there, and so people are going to have to leave their land and they're going to have to migrate. And they punish people over and over again to sort of try to force them to leave their land. So that's sort of, like in the intervention you can see that. It's about establishing this whole idea that colonialism was good. The colonial project in Australia was good. It brought virtuous things. It brought economic development. It brought prosperity. And the reason why those blacks are in such a bad situation is because their culture is backward, because they're degenerate, because they can't take care of themselves. That is what it's about doing. It's trying to win an ideological battle about the legitimacy of the project of colonisation in Australia. How long is that? So I think that the intervention, I did sort of want to, because I was just told to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, so I don't want to go on for too much longer, but I think that the intervention, it remains, and we're having our attention brought to it again as the anniversary of the intervention, is coming up next year. Next week will be 10 years since they started this intervention. It's still going. It's spread out around Australia. The income management system's creeping out around Australia. The whole investment regime, which says we're not going to invest in any community development in remote communities, has now become the policy. Federal government will no longer fund essential services in remote Aboriginal communities anywhere in Australia, so they're all under an enormous amount of pressure. There's no longer a community-based employment program. The Community Development Employment Program, which employed upwards of 40,000 Aboriginal people before the intervention started, which was basically the backbone of most communities, in rural and remote Australia, allowed them to have some form of municipal service, allowed them to have some form of community development. That's been taken away. People are now on this thing they call the CDP scheme, where it's not, they took the E out, so there's no longer any employment involved in it. They have to work 25 hours a week to get their Centrelink pay, which is quarantined. So in the Northern Territory in particular, you're on the basic card, so they're literally working for rations, as they were, through the thing. If you don't turn up for your menial little job with the council or whatever you're being forced to do to get your basic card, you get cut off, so you lose income, people literally starving. If you don't turn up for 4 days in a row, or for the week, for the 5 days you're supposed to go for the week, they'll cut you off for 8 weeks. You lose no income whatsoever. There's thousands and thousands of people that just don't bother with Centrelink because it's just so onerous. They've got no income whatsoever. So it really is like an enormous sort of crisis situation, that exists, sort of across remote Australia as a result of these policies. I think that in that context, it really is important as we're coming up to the 10-year to re-demand that the intervention stops, but also to look at the silent intervention that continues to go on across Australia. As I mentioned before, a lot of the advocacy that I do is around the issue of continued forced removal of Aboriginal children. Absolutely something must be done about that now. They need urgently to put Aboriginal people in control of their own child protection services, to be able to respond in ways that can support families, that can value the leadership that exists in communities, that can value the love and care that people get from their extended families, rather than persecuting people, using police to take children away. It has to stop. And it can only really be stopped by forcing this system to concede. The system wants Aboriginal people gone. As I said, the whole thing's premised on terra nullius. The very fact of people surviving and continuing to say, we remain here, we remain here, we remain here, we refuse to go away, they're persecuted for it, but it is a thorn in the side of the way that the entire system works here. People urgently need support to be able to take control of their own affairs, have control, of their communities, have resources put in their hands so they can actually develop their communities. And I think ultimately, challenging the colonial narratives means challenging the colonial structures of power and reinventing the way we actually organise life here in Australia. I mean, I personally don't think that any just little land settlement here or there will do it. I think it actually requires a fundamental reorganisation of the way we organise our economy, which puts workers in control. You know, socialism, you know, in Australia will require saying this is Aboriginal land. Everyone should be entitled to services. Everyone should be entitled, to public good. We should all have, control and a say in our workplaces. We should all be able to have power. We must respect that we are on Aboriginal land, and we must respect that Aboriginal people who've been here for thousands and thousands of years should be at the centre of decision making about how the resources here are used and about how these lands are used. So I think that that needs to also be developed and also be struggled for if we're going to overcome, the vicious racism which continues to plague us all, which continues to deny the truth about where we are and what we all are. My last little point, I live in a place in Arncliffe. It's very close to a place they've just named Discovery Point. Right? There's this whole development in Walleye Creek that they've called Discovery Point, which is the place that Cook sailed in and said they should set up the colony. The river next to it is called the Cook's River, right? And all the streets are named after the early pioneers that came out here and massacred people. We're living in a lie, It's not the Cook's River. He was here for a week and he shot people and then left. It's not Discovery Point. There's people who've been there for thousands of years. No one discovered it. We're all living a lie, and it profoundly alienates, I think, all of us, So I think, in that sense, it's restoring that truth that it's Aboriginal land and Aboriginal people should have that power, is a part of the process of trying to liberate us all. Thank you. Cheers.